The Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network presents The Monstrous Regiment, featuring a roundtable of Dominion women seeking to honor Jesus Christ in applying God's Word fearlessly and faithfully in all callings and seasons of life, both in and out of the home, reversing the curse and smashing pagan strongholds.
I have loved some ghost or other all my years, dead men, their kisses and their fading eyes, dim in the house of memory, glimmers in twilight air no more. They were not there to say no to me when I wanted them, so it was safe to love them. And dead gods, blind eyes and plaster in the safe museum, the broken hands without the thunderbolt, and the lost mouths that could not laugh at prayers I did not make to them. And a worse ghost, the thin, unearthly shadow of tomorrow scudding ahead of my realities, that since it never could be overtaken, could never disappoint me. Dear shadows, images of bare branches on the snow already melting, images of dwindled sun and the shadows of eclipse running like ghosts of snakes along the ground while the moon's shadow passes, ghosts of ghosts, the twittering echoes of the strengthless dead who do no harm. Only the terrible now I dared not love, not the Word made flesh, not the incarnation bearing a sword to strike me to the heart, not that which is, but is not I, not God or Son or blood or anything real that when I spoke it could not say no to me. For I have loved my own ghost all these years, till there is nothing to say yes to me, till there is only vast and lightless nothing, and in the heart of it not even I. O love, let shadows flee. O living sun, living God, incarnate sword of edged reality, let me be hurt, but let me live enough to die. That is a poem by Joy Davidman. She's an accomplished writer, poet, and late wife of C.S. Lewis. And today we have with us a very esteemed guest who's done us the honor of chatting with me today, Douglas Gresham, her son. And without further ado, I will introduce him. Hi, Douglas. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. And yourself?
I'm wonderful. How is it there in Malta? We have torrential tornadoes here in Oklahoma currently.
Well, we haven't had any tornadoes lately in Malta. We did have a hurricane a while back, which knocked down about 12 trees in our gardens.
Oh,
but on the whole, it's now turning slowly, very slowly, which is unusual for Malta, into summer, I think. The sun is shining outside and things are beginning to get warm.
Oh, well, that is lucky for you. I'm in the middle of a just absolutely torrential downpour for the last 24 hours or so. So if there's a horrible siren in the background, that means I'm going to run for the shelter.
Okay.
I introduced some of your mother's accomplishment, but I forgot to mention that you are, as we discussed, an accomplished author, actor, voice actor, producer, newscaster in your own right.
And lots of other things, too.
And lots of other things, too. I couldn't even list them all.
Big farmer, dairy farmer, tractor driver, bulldozer driver. You can just go on and on and on if you want.
None of which I have done any of that. So
there you go.
I haven't had a chance yet to read your book about your life with your mother and with and Lewis. I believe Lenten Times. I'm looking forward to reading it.
I hope you enjoy it.
I am very much looking forward to it. I'm sure I will. But since that's more your story to tell, obviously, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about who your mother was and her journey? Everybody sort of knows, C.S. Lewis had a wife. Her name was Joy. She passed away.
Yes.
But there's obviously much, much more to her than that's really not a description of her at all, but of a few things that happened to her. So we'd love to hear about her, who she was and her life from your perspective.
Well, of course, from my perspective, she was mommy. That's about it, really. She was very kind, very helpful. She was very, very helpful to me when I needed anything. But the problem is really trying to describe my mother in well, I've done to a certain extent as best I can in Lenten Lands. But the problem is she didn't live long enough. I was born in 1945, and I was 14 years old when she died. And she had been sick, very, very, very sick, for about 5 years before that. initially we didn't know what was wrong, of course. But eventually, when I was about, I suppose, I don't know how old I was exactly, but it was suddenly realized that she was smitten with terminal cancer and was unlikely to live a very long time at all. And of course, she did die about 4 years after that diagnosis was made. So it was a childhood which I think was probably from most viewpoints rather difficult. I survived. I'm here now to talk about it. But it's very difficult to describe my mother because there were so many changes in our lives concerning her as things went on. My mother and my father divorced when I was 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother promptly, as soon as she could, she fled from America to England, where she had already met C.S. Lewis and knew him, but only as a friend. And we lived in London while he was living in Oxford. And occasionally he would come to London on business or something, and he'd pop in and say hello. And very occasionally, we would go to Oxford. Eventually, we moved to a place called Headington,
Mm-hmm.
and lived in a nice little house there in Old High Street, Headington, for about 2 years. My mother was able to practice her skills as a gardener. She grew most of her own vegetables in the backyard there, in the back garden. She was a great gardener, knew all about wild fruits and so forth as well. She was versed and knowledgeable in many, many fields. And as you know, she was also quite a writer. But at the end of that whole scene, of course, came when she was suddenly smitten with cancer and dying. And from then on, really, she was an invalid in a wheelchair. In a hospital bed for a while, and then in a wheelchair. After I had prayed very, very powerfully, it turned out, and just as far as I was concerned, it was desperation. I was 10 years old and I'd just been told my mother was dying. And I walked through the churchyard of Holy Trinity Church in Headington Quarry in Oxfordshire. And as I walked into the churchyard, I stepped out of this world into an entirely new environment. Everything was alive. Everything was difficult to describe. Everything was super alive. Every blade of grass had its own life and its own glowingness about it. Every flower, every branch and every tree. And I was made aware that there was a hugely powerful and very grieving presence with me in the churchyard. And he said, though not in loud words, but merely in my mind, if you really cannot make it without your mother, and remember I'm a 10-year-old child and I only knew my mother, she was the only person in the world I had at that stage. If you really can't make it, all you have to do is ask and I can fix it. So I went into the church. I wasn't a practicing religious child at all those days. And I did the altar and I prayed with every fibre of my being that my mother be allowed to live, because I really didn't think I could make it without her. I had no one else. And he said, okay, it's fixed. Go home, be at peace. And so I did. And she went into remission starting about the day or two, 2 days later or something like that. And she lived another 4 years. In that 4 years, I grew to learn of her immense courage in A, dealing with the pain of her dying, her cancer killing her, and B, of also managing to stay not only lucid and on top of it, but also able to crack jokes about it. The only person I've ever met who would tell funny jokes about her own disease when she was dying with it. Anyway, she lived, as I say, for 4 years, and in that 4 years' time, just as she was thought to be dying on her deathbed, she and Jack got married in the eyes of God by a very, very fine young priest at that time, called Peter Bide, a very nice man. And they lived probably the happiest 4 years of either of their lives in that time, from then on until my mother finally died. So it's difficult to describe what she was. She was hugely brave, very amusing and humorous. She didn't suffer fools gladly when she was in pain, but she was very gentle with them when she wasn't. And she was in a lot of pain a lot of the time. She was mommy. That's about it, really.
I'm projecting a little as I listen to that, only because I have a son who's 15 now. And I'm about the age that your mother was when you first traveled to England. That's the part of the book that I'm currently at. And recently divorced from someone who is similar to at least the fictional account of your father. And so I'm imagining my own son having. I'm not ill at all, of course. But I'm just imagining my own son having to cope with that. I'm at a loss for words. I don't know how to express condolences at this stage for something like that, but I really appreciate you sharing that with me, and especially the prayers of a young man desperate for his mother.
Yeah, I think that to me, that was one of the most salient points of my life. Because the first time I really begged God for something that I knew he could provide because he just told me so. But I think one of the most important things I learned from that is when you need something from the Lord, ask. And don't stop asking because he needs to be asked.
Absolutely. And it's not something that most of us as believers are really sort of feelingly alive to, is the fact that we really can ask in that way. It's almost.
I mean, the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen when one asks is for God to say no, and he does so very, very gently. And a short while thereafter, one learns suddenly why he said no, and it makes perfect sense. But in this case, the answer was yes.
Absolutely, that's been my experience. Is that I've been told no, and then I understood. I didn't understand why, and I begged and I pleaded, and then I understood eventually why. But it's almost cheesy to say, but it's very much the biblical example of coming like a child without all of those cynicisms between you and him.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think if any child is desperate enough and has good reason, and there is no reason why God should God doesn't have a valid reason, or doesn't have a reason he wants to use as to why that child shouldn't get what he's asking for, the child very often will. And in a desperate situation like mine, obviously the Lord had plans for my life as much as he had for my mother's. The plan for my mother was running out, and the plan for my life was just starting, I suppose.
Yes, and what more desperate situation can we have than begging for the life of our own mother? I mean,
yeah, I think that's probably very true. I think one would rather die oneself.
Yes, I'm a grown woman, and I would be in the same desperation for my mother, who still lives. But I can't even imagine at 10 years old when we've already, in a sense, lost your father, and to some degree, or lost.
Yeah, it wasn't an easy time. It was a difficult time in my life, and it went on for quite a while.
And was there any comfort in the? Well, not a comfort. That's not what I'm asking. I know that in myself, there's been quite the change in how I'm able to relate to my children and how I'm able to parent after getting out of the marriage, and I feel that they actually have more peace and more rest in our home because it's not continual turmoil and chaos and distress. There's grief, but there's not.
The problem we face with the problem is one of the things that most people don't really understand, I believe, is that a divorce, in a way, is worse than a death because you don't have a body to bury.
Right.
There's no termination. You have to live in that situation of being divorced, and the man is still around or the woman is still around, either way, and that's always going to be shadowing you. So I think it's in a sense it's worse than a death if, for example, one's wife dies, which heaven forbid, or one's husband, then you've at least got something terminal, something finished. It's over, it's done with, and you can move on into other things. I think with a divorce, it's far more difficult to move on to other things. I saw my mother and father trying that, for example, and other friends in the past too. It is possible, and it just takes far more work, I think. Yeah,
and you can't. With a death, you were at least if it was a loving marriage, you can remember with fondness and with honor, and it's harder sometimes.
Of course, yeah. Yes, of course.
But
and all those things help.
I always have hope that at least that there is in some ways improvement, at least from not living in that sort of turmoil of wondering and desperation, but I suppose for you it was one turmoil to the next.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. My mother died in 1960. I think 63 was. I actually can't remember the dates now. I'm useless with dates. But anyway, she died when I was 14.
Right.
And then about a year and a half later, my father over in America committed suicide. Ugh. And a year and a half after that, Jack died. So that was a pretty rough period but I sort of It may sound terrible, but in a way I got used to it.
No,
I got used to the idea that people were going to die on me. And so I ran out of people, of course. And then I had to start thinking for myself a bit more strongly.
It sounds terrible as in the sense that it's a terrible series of experiences. It's terrible for a young person to have to think of in those terms. It doesn't reflect terribly on you. And
well, no, I don't think. What it did, it taught me a huge amount about human life and what happens in it. And it taught me a great deal that I have later, and when I became a psychotherapist, later used to help other people. And I think if you go through a whole lot of things which you later discover in life are useful to helping others who are in torment of some form or other, then I think it's pretty obvious that God had a purpose for it all happening, among many other purposes, of course.
And it's quite clear that God had a particular purpose and took an interest in you from the very beginning. And I'm quite sure that without him, most people would collapse under that much sorrow that early in life and that close together.
Yes, I think you may be right. I don't know about most people, but a lot of people certainly would. I didn't have any option. There was nowhere else to go. There was nothing else to do. I had to survive by myself. So I did.
Yes, that's
mind you. Bear in mind that that event, that series of events, didn't actually galvanize me into giving my life to Christ at that point. I didn't do that till much later in my life.
But he was, as you've described, he was present with you, even though you were not yet submitted or.
Well, he was. Yeah, look, I was aware that he was there, and I was aware that he was with me for many years. But the problem I suffered from, which is actually a bit logical, really, was that everything in my life that I could think of had ended in disaster. So whoever was running it was making a rotten job of it, the way I looked at it at the time. So I wasn't going to turn my life over to someone who really was messing it up. It took me a great many years to realize that I'd probably messed it up a great deal worse than God ever did. Certainly did, in fact.
Our perspective, especially at that age, is going to be pretty narrow in comparison to his, of understanding what he's playing at.
Yeah, very true. Very true indeed.
I'm sorry, I've lost the plot a bit. I've gotten distracted in empathy. Can you tell us anything about her work, what you most appreciate about it, or what you would most like people to know about it and understand?
Well, I think probably her work, like with all of us, is derived from her own childhood again, or partly thereof, and who she wrote, of course, all the books that she read and poetry and so on. But I am actually one of these unfortunate people who is tone deaf to poetry.
Oh no!
Even though I do occasionally write some myself, but when I do it, I know it's coming from God and not from me. But my mother's poetry, some of it I think is excellent, and some of it I just can't get around. I can't understand. So I'm not the best person to ask about poetry. However, her novels I found to be fascinating. She wrote two, Anya and Weeping Bay, I think. And then she wrote a book called Smoke on the Mountain, which I think is one of the best, if not the best, interpretation of the Ten Commandments that I have ever come across anywhere in the world. So I far prefer my mother's serious works of prose than her poetry, because as I say, I'm tone deaf to poetry. I just don't understand it and find it very difficult to enjoy. There are exceptions, of course.
Of course. I completely understand. I have a sister who's a novelist and a sister who is a poet, and I'm neither, but I'm typically more drawn to prose than to poetry. I love poetry, but not. I can't relate to it quite as much. I have not.
Well, my own difficulty is that I usually feel that the poetry somebody gives to me to read, and sometimes it's presumably some of the best poets in the world, I always feel it's farting around with words, whereas prose is making them work.
Yeah, that's probably true, or at least that's. I don't know. It's so often individual. In what speaks to you and what. It's almost like poetry sort of goes under the surface in a way that if your mind is more analytical, then it doesn't it doesn't work for you. I haven't had a chance to read Smoke on the Mountain yet, but I am very excited to read it. I know
it's a wonderful book.
I'm almost sort of saving it for last because I'm so excited to read it. I'm savoring the expectation of it because it's such a beautiful thing to write about, and it's such a fascinating thing to write about. And you don't.
And of course, coming from a Christian with a Jewish background, she has all the sort of points are on her side. I mean, she understands completely the Jewish look at it all, and she also understands where it applies to the Christian world. And she makes that very plain in the book, that she understands both sides.
And that is very lacking sometimes in the Christian perspective, is to remember the Jewish roots of it. For some reason,
of course, Jesus was Jewish.
Yes, and we know that, and yet oftentimes the Christian writings overlook that, or we're just not in touch with it in that context like we should be. So it's or we are, but only hypothetically, because we don't have, like you said, her actual experience with it, where it's in your upbringing and you completely understand it. We understand it in more anthropological. This is a tradition we've read about that some people somewhere have participated in, but it's not really.
I think that's very true.
You mentioned her novels and her nonfiction work, and then of course Lewis is wildly popular for his novels, but also for his nonfiction work. And both him and Tolkien have written defenses of fiction. Some people pose those two, nonfiction or fiction against each other, which is obviously not necessary. But I was curious your thoughts about the merits of both for communicating, the truths of Scripture, and in which ways each format adapts to that better. If you understand.
It's an interesting question. It's an interesting idea that I don't think there's any difference necessarily in the way fiction would transmit more understanding of the Gospels, for example, or of the Bible, or of Christianity, than the actual studying of it and writing a book about Christianity. Jack did both, as you know. Mm-hmm. Jack wrote quite a lot of fiction, and his best ever work of fiction, I think, is a book called Till We Have Faces. And what most people are unaware of is that was a collaboration between my mother and Jack. And he wanted to have it published under both their names, but she refused to let him do so on the grounds that it would damage the sales of the book. Well, interestingly enough, he regarded it as his best ever book of fiction. And it's taken till now, just recently, that people students, and great scholars have started to realize just the great depth and value of that book, and are beginning to realize that it was probably his best ever work of fiction. It's taken a long time to get there. But it didn't sell very well at the time. In fact, he felt it was his best book that never really sold. I think now it's probably beginning to. But it was a collaboration between the two, and anyone who really knew them both well can hear the different voices in the writing. So I don't really know. The Till We Have Faces is a book which points out some huge and very interesting facts about Christianity and how it should work. But then again, of course, he wrote other things like Mere Christianity, which is much more plain and outspoken. And The Great Divorce, for example, is a classic example of how he has used, in a sense, a fictional piece to transmit enormous truth. So that's a difficult question to answer. I think it requires a lot of study. It is quite possible that certain authors have the talent to use fiction and of course one of them was George MacDonald, who Jack always regarded as his literary master. They have the ability to transmit hugely important Christian facts in the sort of coat or costume of a work of fiction. And with both MacDonald and Jack, it works very, very well.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you bring up Till We Have Faces, which I agree is probably his best work of fiction, and it's one of my personal favorites of all fiction ever. and has always been enormously meaningful to me. When you first had emailed us that your mother had helped write that, just a universal girlish shriek went up amongst myself and my co-hosts of just joy, and it because we don't obviously know them well. As you said, anybody who knows them well can recognize their distinct voices. We don't know them well, but we could hear a different voice there. I've always regarded it, and I know Susanna has as well, as one of the, if not the best, female representations of a female from a male author. And the explanation of that is, of course, what you just said, that it wasn't entirely from a female author. It was from a male author and a female author working together.
Exactly.
I mean, there are some passages in there. I wasn't able to find all of them, but when I was sort of re-skimming it, but there are things in there that commentaries on men that are not even true in an objective sense of what kinds of people men are, but they are a very, very true representation of how a woman, and a certain kind of woman in a certain kind of scenario, would feel about men or the men in her life.
Yeah, that's more or less what gives it away. That my mother was hard burnt right inside that book, and still is. She of course had been through a divorce as well before she met Jack. Well, she had met him, but it was after she'd met him, actually, before she and Jack really got together.
Right.
And she knew what that felt like, and she knew what it felt like to be rejected. She of course knew all of the various things and feelings and emotions that female people go through, and men just don't. Most of us just don't understand them, and it's difficult to try to get to grips with them, even in today's world. But my mother really did understand, and of course, and she helped Jack. Well, when Jack claimed that she in a conversation with someone else present, I forget who it was, and it might have been Roger Lancelin Green, actually. He was saying that she had been such an enormous help at writing that book, and she immediately jumped on him and said, "Oh no, Jack, all I did was to teach you how to write from a feminine perspective and how to sound more like yourself."
And she did teach him to write from a feminine perspective marvelously well. I remember reading it for the first time when I was only about 20, I think, or maybe 25. And I didn't know, of course, all of this about her collaboration or her influence. I don't think I knew at the time that it even happened after knowing her or after their marriage. And I remember reading certain things and thinking, how did he know? I didn't even know. I couldn't have even articulated that that's how I felt. And yet he articulated my own heart to me somehow. And so when I find out exactly how and I learn about her background, it all clicks so beautifully into place. And it's a really beautiful demonstration of what God meant in the first chapter of Genesis when he says that it's not good for man to be alone. People sometimes misuse or abuse that passage, but really men and women need each other in order to communicate and understand others.
They do, but I also believe more than that. I think men and women who are alone aren't really complete. I mean, a man who has not got a wife and a woman who doesn't have a husband and so forth, I don't believe that's a whole human being when you get the two parts separated. I believe the whole human being comes together when a man and a woman are together in holy matrimony, to put it sort of kind of archaically. I don't think there's any way around that. I don't think we're real. I don't think we're really there until we have at least experienced it, even if it fails. Because we don't understand each other, and we never will understand each other unless we get together and stay together. Do you see what I mean?
I do. Or at the very least, I think perhaps we can have an understanding between each other in the other kinds of love if we learn to be brothers and sisters to each other.
I think that's probably that would be a huge help. I should have elaborated a little more and said, if a man who has never had a sister and never had a cousin who's female, has never had encounters with a female, I don't think one can be complete without some sort of experience of understanding how women think, and the women how men think, for that matter.
Absolutely. I
think it's desperately important.
Yes, we shouldn't exist in sort of these female spheres and this separate male spheres. We have to be we have to be together and learn from each other and have sisters in Christ or sisters in the flesh, or I mean
whatever. Yeah.
We are.
I always wanted, when I was a little boy, when I was small, I had a brother, and my brother and I didn't get on, and I always longed to have a little sister. I never did. I had a little for a short while. I had a stepsister and first cousin once removed, who was Renee's child, and her brother, of course, was there too. They came and lived with us in Statsburg for a while, and I went away from that experience when they left, sort of bereft in a sense, because I really wanted to know more about how this little girl would have thought. She was a bit considerably younger than me, but I just kept looking around in my own mind and my own heart as to try to understand more and more what the emotional and mental difference was between the two species, if you like, or two sexes of one species. And I never really found out until I got married.
Yeah, I have a brother. I have 7 siblings, and it's quite a few girls, and then a boy, and then quite a few girls, and then a boy. And one of my younger brothers, Joel, when he got married, we were talking about it when he would have children, and he said, well, I will love any child that I have, of course, but I hope that I have girls first, because I think every little boy should have older sisters. Which was
absolutely agreed. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. He's a wise man.
It was very touching to me as one of the older sisters to hear that he had that experience.
I'm sure.
And I'm sure if you were a little girl that had older brothers, you'd feel the exact same / opposite way. But
probably.
I only have younger.
I'm afraid we're going to have to bring. I'm afraid we're going to have to bring this to a halt fairly soon, because I have another commitment coming up in about 5 minutes.
Yes, I'm so sorry. It's been digressing quite a bit, but that's
it's been fun.
That's quite all right, because what we really want to hear is just anything that you would want to share with us, and we particularly wanted to hear about Till We Have Faces, just because it's such a masterpiece, and the fact that it's a co-labor between them is even more.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way. I mean, I've had people who have sort of exploded in my face when I've told them that, not believed it. But it is absolutely true. There was a collaboration, and it works as a collaboration. The two of them together, I think, I'm just so sad that they never had time to write 3 or 4 more books together.
I am sad too,
because I think they would have
together in heaven.
taken the world by storm.
The longing that you just evoked in me by saying that. To read those books that haven't existed, or not on this plane.
True.
I suppose in closing, since you don't have a lot of time, I think that reading your mother's poetry and reading about her life, what stands out to me is she was a Christian artist, at least for some of her life, the later part of her life. But her work is, to steal a little from Lewis, is not safe. It's good, but it's not safe. It's raw. And it shows, it reveals, passions and pains that are not strictly pious or ladylike seeming. And to me, that's a huge contrast.
Wait a minute. I don't think anyone needs to write, if they're writing the truth, I don't think they need to write it as if they were preaching.
Exactly.
And I think Jack himself shied away from that. My mother's books, my mother's 2 novels, are amazingly instructive about how life should be led and how it can be destroyed by oneself. But there's nothing preachy about it.
Exactly.
But you learn an awful lot from reading them about Christianity and about how it could work if you got it right.
Absolutely.
The problem is very few of us ever get it right. Jack was one of the very few who did.
And that's what I value so much about the work. I feel like today a lot of what passes for Christian art is just sort of, it's not really art at all. It's just sort of some sort of safe, cleaned up version of life that's not a real life, but it doesn't have a swear word in it, so it's okay or something. So I'd be interested if you had any advice for aspiring
one of the oddest things about that in America, is that you have invented all sorts of swear words that are actually completely innocuous.
I know.
It's simply your attitude that makes them sound bad. I once got in an awful lot of trouble in a lecture I was giving, in front of an audience at a Q&A, because a woman asked me if we had any pets at Rathlinden Ministries, which we were running at the time. I said, yes, we have 3 dogs. She said, are they little girls or little boys? Which, of course, sort of chilled my spirit a bit. And I said, no, they're all bitches. And she went off her brain. You know?
Even though
how could you dare use such a terrible word for little puppy dogs? You know, I finally said, man, has it escaped your education that the word bitch is the technical term for any female of the canine species? And she sat down, and all the audience was applauding. She sat down very embarrassed. But I mean, it is not a bad word at all. No. And you've done that. Americans have done that with so many words. It's ridiculous.
I knew someone once who wouldn't read. I think it was one of the Space trilogy because Lewis had said damn. And the grief that I felt at the loss of what they were missing because of a fear, and it was in the appropriate context of something being damned to hell, which is a completely valid thing to say.
It's not a wicked word, it's not a swear word, it's an actual factual word.
Exactly.
If you do things the wrong way, you may well suffer damnation. It's not a swear, it's not an oath. You know, anyway.
Yes.
I have to go, my dear, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for chatting with me and for condescending to give me some of your time. And
you're very welcome.
So appreciate it. We appreciate your work and your mother's work, and we're looking forward to...
Thank you.
I hear you're the producer on the new Narnia series, so we're hoping that it does it justice this time around. Or
well, we'll do our best.
One of the I'm sure that your voice will be very valuable there. So thank you so much.
Thank you indeed for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
Have a lovely rest of your evening.
And you too. God bless.
God bless you too. Thank you so much. That was Douglas Gresham, author of Lenten Times, My Life with C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman. And as you heard, accomplished jack of all trades in every way, speaking to us about his mother and about God and about women and men and all the things that we are interested in here at the Monstrous Regiment. I highly recommend that everyone with interest to learn more about Joy Davidman, who was a just beautifully accomplished person in a short time, and whose work really cuts to your heart. Her works of fiction are Weeping Bay, Anya. She wrote Smoke on the Mountain about the Ten Commandments. There are 2 biographies about her. And God Came In by Lyle Dorset. Joy by Abby Santamaria, if I'm reading my own handwriting correctly. And there is a semi-fictional biography, which Douglas has told us is actually the most accurate of the 3, despite being semi-fictional, which is Becoming Mrs. Lewis. And of course, anyone who has not read Till We Have Faces, a myth retold by Lewis and by Joy Davidman, should immediately go buy it and forget to do anything else until they have read it 2 or 3 times. Thank you for joining us today, and stay monstrous.
Thank you for listening to the Monstrous Regiment. We hope this podcast inspires and equips you to go and exercise dominion for Christ's kingdom, terrible as an army with banners. The Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network brings to you a complete lineup of podcasts where you will hear practical and tactical theology. Our desire is not simply that you consume our shows, but that you also live out your faith in every area of life. We can talk all day long about these things, but if we fail to put them into practice, then we fail as ambassadors of Jesus Christ, our King. Subscribe now to your favorite Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network shows, or you can subscribe to the Reconstructionist Radio Master Feed, where all of the content we produce, including the audiobooks and audio articles, will pop up as soon as they are available. And don't forget to visit ReconstructionistRadio.com to volunteer as a narrator or to partner with this ministry financially. May the Holy Spirit stir you into action for Christ and His kingdom.